Welcome. Welcome to an episode of the From the Pure Land podcast. This, once again, is going to be a video cast. Once again, going to be an interview. We're kind of on a streak of interviews, and this time, the interviewee is me. And the interviewer is my son's fiancée, Kenna Day. She's a professor of English, which makes her qualified to ask me probing questions. And she's very good at probing questions. That's why I asked her to do this. Once again, you can access my blog at melpine.substack.com. And yes, I've said everything I can say for an introduction. Kenna, why don't you ask me a question or introduce yourself further if you like?
I mean, you pretty much nailed it. I know your son, and I teach English, and I like to ask questions. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to be a part of your entire spiritual journey and this awesome project that you're working on. I think the first thing that I want to ask you about is kind of related to the beginning of your spiritual journey. What brought you to Buddhism in the first place?
Well, there are a lot of answers to that question. Well, one was life events. When I was in my mid-30s, I guess, I had a shock in my life, and the book that I'm almost finished writing includes a section of where my life intersected with my spiritual journey. And so one point was when I had a major tragedy. Well, it's in the book. My first cousin shot his parents to death, my uncle and aunt, and he and I had been close, and a lot of reverberations. You can wait for the book to hear all the details, to read all the details, or if hear them on audiobook. But it launched me to look for a religion I could live with. I had dropped out of Judaism for a number of reasons. It's the religion of my birth and my ethnic heritage, and I identify ethnically with the story of Jewish history, but I do not identify with the religion, at least not as practiced when I was a child. I think things are better today. But I went out looking, and I ended up with Buddhism. One thing that talked to me in the beginning was the emphasis on the present moment. Past is irrelevant, future unpredictable. I mean, there's a lot more as I got more into it. I'd read some Zen, and didn't understand it. But I started out with Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Miracle of Mindfulness. And so I started out with a mindfulness-oriented practice. And then about 10 years ago, another cosmic event, the accidental death of my son Thomas, who was 29 at the time, led me to dive deeper. And so the last 10 years have been a really deep dive into I don't want to say advanced, but a more esoteric, a more complicated, a more spiritual, a more mystical type of Buddhism, and really facing my own death. It's time of life to do that. So all those things added up to where I am today. I think Buddhism is all about uncertainty, but it's about recognizing that from the start. Don't expect more. The whole existential angst of the world not giving the individual what the individual wants or thinks he, she, or they want. Buddhism says, yeah, that's the starting point. Everything else goes from there. But the starting point is uncertainty, impermanence. There's very little that we can be certain of. And one of those things is a kind of a pure awareness, nature of mind, Buddha nature, but it's a pure awareness that perceives the world as it really is with all its problems, if we can learn to relax into and accept it, make friends with it. Well, I really don't take anything for granted. If somebody's late, if somebody gets stuck in traffic and they're an hour late for showing up for a Zoom interview, hey, I mean, that's of course a small thing, but I don't have expectations. I don't know how long ago, but I had a really traumatic hospital experience. And it was the hospitalization from hell. And it made me really phobic about ever going into a hospital again. And then go ahead some years, and I was scheduled for shoulder replacement surgery. And I was having coffee with a friend who's happens to be a Pure Land Buddhist priest. And he said, well, how has your practice prepared you for the surgery you're about to? And I thought about it, and I realized the phobia was gone. I mean, I'll show up and it'll either be good or it won't. So that's sort of a more significant way that knowing that I can't be certain of anything gets me over the fear of it going badly. I think Hemingway is quoted as having said something like, it's better to know the worst than to go on day after day in fear of the worst. Well, uncertainty is like knowing the worst. Yes, I have had 3 hip dislocations, and that's the absolute worst pain I've ever had and I can imagine having. And it's the kind of pain where you're stuck in one position. If you move even a millimeter, it's going. So you've got to just stay there. Luckily, it always happened when I had a cell phone in my hand, nearby, and didn't have to drag myself somewhere for help. But can I say for sure how I would act if I had that kind of pain again? I can't say for sure, but I can say that I don't sit here in fear of it. There is a certain medical procedure that I've always feared, even though it's not serious and painful to a lot of people. It just happens to touch my nerves. And there's something coming up where I might have one of those, and I'm much more able now to deal with that. Well, lately I've discovered a great figure in Buddhism who didn't get well known, and is sort of his heritage is dying off, and I'm hoping after I wrap up this book I can do something to revive his heritage. But in terms of a particular thing, I think it is a comfort level with what to me is a kind of a formula for a joyful, awakened life. And I'm not sure if I'm going to get it all perfectly right, but an important element is what I call making friends with your mind. You know, many of us are enslaved by our mind. You know, we feel it's like a very active puppy that isn't trained, and it's going, oh, maybe we can do this, and maybe we can do that. And hey, you sure you want that? And hey, did you just make a mistake? And what are we going to do tomorrow? Uh-oh, is that going to happen tomorrow? You know, so this frisky puppy, I know it's called the monkey mind, but I think a frisky puppy might be a better. When you train a frisky puppy, one of the things you do is you train it to look at you. You hold a treat here so it looks into your eyes and you get its attention. And similarly, by observing, being aware of what our mind is doing from that calm, pure awareness that I mentioned before. And this is something you have to learn to do. It's not something you can read in a book. But just like when you've begun to train a puppy, as you start to pay attention to it, it behaves. And so you become friends. And I think that's a state that one needs to get to with one's mind. And of course, in Buddhism, there's a lot about letting go of ego, letting go of attachments. We think we're different from everybody else. Hey, I'm special. I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, you know. And I can't say I live in this sense of oneness with everything as though we all melt into each other. But I am acutely aware that we live in this intricately interconnected web of existence. And everything depends on every. I heard a quote just the other day. I think it was in Carl Sagan or somebody like that said, in order to explain how to boil an egg, you have to start with the creation of the universe. So everything is that interconnected. I mean, everything in the universe is just a rearrangement of tiny something or others, and they might not even be real something or others that come together in different patterns. So making friends with one's mind, letting go of the ego and feeling the interconnectedness with everything with a sense of compassion. Well, it follows. If you do the first two, the compassion necessarily follows. And that's the formula that I've come to. I guess I should also mention that part of the formula for me is this sense that I already live in a pure land, that everything in this world is perfect because it couldn't be anything else. It's all the product of causes and conditions, and it is what it is. And sure, we can feel compassion for what's going on in the Gaza Strip, for example. But we as individuals, even a lot of us as individuals, are not able to stop wars. It won't change until we figure out how to change, starting with ourselves. And so, of course, sending money to contribute to people displaced in Gaza is a commendable thing to do, but it might even be more valuable to meditate and become a better person in the long run. What do we have to do but be examples for each other? The point I'm getting to is that we all have an impact on each other. So the more of us who can learn to live at peace and in equanimity and not violently and understanding the stupidity and futility of a lot of the stuff that goes on in the world, the more of us who can live that way, demonstrate that people can live that way, maybe that in the long run it comes to a change. So it's not all inevitable, but it's not something that can be solved in any short-term time frame.
So are you kind of talking about the concept of like butterfly effect almost? That the changes we make within ourselves eventually ripple out and will affect the world on a grander scale.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the butterfly effect is real. Well, the other thing is the famous parable of the Chinese farmer, where his son breaks a leg and somebody says, "Oh, that's terrible." And he says, "Well, or that's bad luck." And so, "Well, maybe it's bad, maybe it's not." And it turns out breaking his leg got him out of the draft. And then somebody says, "Oh, that was good luck," and maybe, maybe not. And it's another outcome. I'm sure many people have heard some version of that story. So we don't know, when you get out into the further and further waves, it's hard to know what the result of any action is. I don't agree, for example, with the way Trump and the vice president treated the president of Ukraine the other day. But if the actual result is less people dying, that's the sort of the Chinese, or fewer people, I should say, to be more accurate, as a former copy editor. That's kind of what the Chinese farmer story was about. We don't know what eventual outcomes are going to be, but I can be pretty sure that the people around me, at least, will benefit from my more resolved, more awakened status. And yes, it will have a ripple effect.
I'm curious about your concept of compassion, right? Like, how would you define what true compassion is?
That's a really good question. It's a really important concept. And Buddhism, I talk about Buddhism as though it's like a monolithic thing, but
But of course, it's not.
it's not. But in general, most Buddhist teachers divide. There's a difference between compassion and loving kindness. When we have compassion, we really care about the people who are suffering. I use the example of Gaza, suffering in Gaza. And it's a genuine caring. When we have loving kindness, we're more apt to get personally involved, to do something for them.
Oh, so it's action based.
Yes, in Buddhism, you sort of differentiate between compassion and compassion in action. Tara, green Tara, is depicted with one foot out, always ready to spring to action,
Mhm.
to turn. The Taras generally, well, there are 21 Taras, and they all have compassion. I think that's safe to say, but they exhibit it in different ways. And one of the things about Green Tara is that she's ready to jump to help people. Now, having said that, there's a danger in too much of that. If one becomes an empath, starts to go, "Oh my God, I can't help everybody. What am I going to do? That can then get in the way. So it's compassion and loving kindness, but not getting attached to, not getting personally attached to the outcome.
Okay. So this is where it gets complicated for me morally. Like how does one care in the way that you're talking about? Like how do you carry the burden of knowledge knowing that there is suffering in the world and not be attached? I mean, I know that's a difficult question to answer. I don't know that anyone can really fully answer that, but
Yeah.
you're a pretty smart guy, so I figure you could probably know.
Well, I'm a guy who has a lot of equanimity, a lot of ability not to get absorbed in calamities, and that may uh, that may come from, well, two sources, and it's not something that I set out to do. Buddhism was perfect for me because I already have the equanimity that it asks you to develop. I already have the knowledge of impermanence too, that it asks you to develop, because that those things came naturally. But I was born in 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II, to a father who was an immigrant from what's now Belarus, and if he hadn't immigrated, would have been wiped out in the Holocaust. He had a brother and sister. He each got married and each had children. So I was born after two uncles and two aunts and five first cousins were wiped out in the Holocaust. And I grew up knowing that. I grew up aware in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood where some people still, had the tattoos on their arms. When I was about 4 or 5, my parents took me to visit a couple that they had sponsored from the displaced persons camps. Um, so I grew up with an awareness that awful things can happen, and I cared a lot. But I guess it helped me get off to that kind of start. I also had a role model in my father who didn't seem to get flustered, didn't hate anybody. I never heard him. I had relatives who would get upset if I bought a used book that was written by somebody connected to Germany, for example. Whereas that wasn't my father at all. He was very kind of accepting of people and things as they are. He didn't hold grudges. I mean, here's a guy who lost a brother and sister and their families, and I don't know how many other members of his extended family in the Holocaust, and I never saw any bitterness in him. So I think that helped formulate early my equanimity. Now, I can't, recommend go out and live through a disaster, but exposing oneself to people dying, to people ill, to people in trouble.
All right. So for you, the difference between the awareness of suffering between your Jewish upbringing and where you are now with your Buddhism, it's not about wallowing so much or like welcoming it or like making it a part of your identity. It's more just a general kind of distant acceptance that suffering happens.
Yeah, I think the Jewish stereotype,
Right.
and there's some truth in stereotypes. The Jewish stereotype is someone who can't let go of the suffering, kind of almost enjoys it, you know.
I've never thought of Jewish people that way, but I'm
Oh,
sure
my
yes,
pain is
that is a
my pain is worse.
stereotype, yeah.
My pain is worse than your pain.
Oh, the Pain Olympics, yes,
Yeah,
okay.
that kind of thing. And this is not, look, you know, I could easily be accused of being prejudiced against my own ethnicity, but I'm just describing my observations.
No, yeah, that's why I was
So I
curious
don't
about it
I
because
don't
you
want
did
to
live through it, so
yeah, so I don't want to tie up the equanimity with the Judaism.
okay.
I mean, yes, being aware of suffering. I mean, if you look at Jewish history, I was somewhat shocked. I guess I should have known this, but on a trip that Carol and I took a few years ago around Europe, we were on a river cruise, and in so many ancient cities, there was this section of, oh, this is where the Jews lived before we threw them out, and before we banished them, and and before they were slaughtered. I mean, this has gone on throughout history, and I don't understand exactly why, but it is part of the Jewish heritage, and I don't mean to belittle the idea that some people may come out of that with a comfort level of suffering because it's what you're used to.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. I mean, a lot of people who are maybe not super historically aware, right, think that anti-Semitism started at, the beer hall putsch, and that's when it began, right? But in reality, it goes back to the dawn of Abrahamic religions, right? So it is understandable that some people would create a sort of cultural narrative about suffering and suffering only. I do think it's interesting hearing you talk about like the move from culturally and ethnically Jewish to Buddhism because I'm starting to see some commonalities between the two. It's almost like your concept of suffering has evolved, and I don't know, it's almost like going through a 12-step program, right? Like now you're at acceptance, right? Like rather than defiance or I don't know. So, it's interesting to me. That's all. Because you have had a fascinating spiritual journey. So yeah. I did wanna ask you to talk about the book. I wanna hear about why you started writing a book in the first place.
5 or 6 years ago in my practice, I feel like I let go of my ego. I let go at least of the clinging ego. And when I let go of the ego, I stopped writing. I had been blogging, and I've been done some sort of writing and editing most of my life, much of it professionally and much of it for other people or in journalism or something. And I never wrote much on my own. Never attempted anything like a book project. But I did have a blog for a few years. And I stopped that because what's the motivation to write if I've let go of my ego? I'm writing to be recognized. Hey, it's me. Pay attention to me, or I have something to say, or
Yeah, it's a
and
legacy.
then I guess I realized that I wasn't doing something I could be doing to help the world get over wars and stuff. In other words, part of Vajrayana Buddhism, which I practice, is called bodhicitta, a really strong commitment to relieve everybody's suffering by, if possible, teaching the Dharma. But if not, some some aspects of the Dharma anyway. So I kind of said to myself, hey, jerk, you know how to write, you know how to blog. You're not doing enough to manifest your bodhicitta. Start blogging. And I don't know, and the blogging became pretty intense. I was writing close to a blog post a day, short, but a blog a day, doing a lot of research with the help of my trusty AI companion, who I checked very thoroughly. And I reached a point where I said, you know what? I have something to say in all this stuff I've been writing. I have something that maybe would be a book.
Mhm.
When I got started working on the book, that also was similar in that as I got deeper into writing the book, I learned more and more, and I became more and more confident that, you know what? I got some answers. I mean, we always question. I mean, everything's always a question. I don't mean the answer, but I think I have advice after almost 80 years of life and almost 40 years of studying Buddhism, have some advice to help people find a spiritual path in the West, which is lacking spiritual paths. Buddhism as my path. And so that's what I can explain. But my blog appeals to a lot of recovering Christians, people deconstructing religion altogether. You know, even though I talk Buddhist, I think I have something that might help people in general. And I've come to a kind of a less intense and more liberal presentation of trying to get Westerners to relax into Buddhism. You know, not to be uptight. You know, I got to read another book. I got to go to another Dharma talk. I got to find the right this or the right that, you know, to kind of, well, you'll have to read the book when it comes out to get the full advice. There's going to be 45,000 words or so, about 200 pages. But decided that I really have something to say. Then as I wrote it, and I've included personal anecdotes throughout, but toward the end, I get into a kind of a memoiristic section about my own life and how it and my practice have intertwined. So it's become my life's work. This is it. This is the culmination. I mean, I have more things to do. I might have another book coming up because I have this specific idea of another one that I might do as soon as I'm finished this one.
Oh, you're definitely going to. I already know you're going to. Like,
I'm enjoying myself, but my life, what I have to offer to the world is in this book.
so I have multiple follow-up questions to that, but I like this idea, the way that you're talking about how your view of the purpose of writing a book in the first place sort of changed for you. Because I've always thought of writing as a writer and as a person who studies and teaches writing and reads way too much. I've always sort of thought of writing as a legacy project. This is the thing that I will leave behind. If I leave nothing else behind, I made something, like I wrote something down. But it is a self-serving concept. It's the idea of making yourself immortal as a way of defeating your own mortality. So now that you've put it this way, that it's not about memorializing yourself necessarily. You are in the book. You are very present in the book. I've been lucky enough to read a little bit of it, and I love it so far, and I'm excited to read the rest. But it's not so much about recording yourself as if you are so important that you must exist forever. It's more about what can you do to help others in the future after you're not here, or even while you still are, you know? And I think that that's really beautiful. It's more of a contribution to the world than it is a monument to how awesome you are. You know what I mean? So
Well, I am awesome, you
yeah,
know.
you are. I can attest. You definitely are. So I think that that's really interesting, but I'm also curious about, like, how do you decide when you are working on the book? How do you decide what to include about yourself and what to leave out? Because there's no way that you could capture your entire life and all the lessons you've learned in one book. So was there a certain process for, well, I can leave this story out, or I absolutely have to include this story because somebody could learn something from it?
You know, I differ from the models that a lot of people recommend. I have a lot of experience writing and editing nonfiction, editing more than writing. But when I started writing this book, started with a beginning. But I was aware that I had to produce a proposal with a chapter outline. So once I had a start and I kind of knew how it was going, I did the chapter outline. And once I did the chapter outline, I went, oh, well, this part over here, I can use this bit from the blog post that I wrote once and amplify it and stick it over here and stick it over there. And I started to think in terms of the whole thing. And when I do actually write new material, it kind of flows. I know I know it's one of those mysterious things that writers say, but it's like almost like something else takes over me. I mean, there was a time that I felt as though my son Thomas, after his death, was in me and helping me toward a kind of creativity that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. Uh,
Yeah.
Now I'm kind of feeling something like that again. It might be Thomas and Buddha Amitabha too,
Mm.
whatever it or it might not. I'm very open to believing everything and nothing. But there is a flow that comes over me. So I don't think so much of, oh, should I include this anecdote or not? I do think in terms of absolute honesty.
Talk about being a student, but also trying to teach other people, trying to at least offer some kind of resource through what you have to say, what you've learned over the course of your life. Do you see yourself as a teacher now? I mean, not in terms of like being part of the, I don't even have the language for it because I'm not a Buddhist, but do you see yourself as being sort of a public voice to help educate the populace, to try to give them some way of making sense of life now?
Yeah, that's a hard question because I'm very aware that I have no real credentials as a Buddhist teacher. I have no transmit. There are certain things in Vajrayana Buddhism you should have transmission from
Of
the
course.
teacher. There are various programs one can go through to get a certificate of, oh, you're a mindfulness teacher, or you're this teacher, or you're that teacher. And there was a time I wanted to be a teacher. And by a teacher, I mean have classes, do meditation, do a Dharma talk, the way a lot of quote unquote teachers do. I may be teaching something, but I'm not a teacher.
Ah,
Um,
okay. You're not a teacher with a capital T. I got it. Okay.
however, I have reached a point with the book where I feel as though this is something that maybe if it touches a nerve or if it gets widely enough recognized, this is something that might make a difference to enough people
Mm.
that they will consider it a teaching resource.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if at the if at the heart of it, that's what all writing tries to do, all good writing, at least, right? Like, why do we read in the first place? It's in some way to deal with what we are personally experiencing or to learn something about the world or to broaden our horizons, expand our perspective, right? That's what good writing does, in my opinion. And I think it sounds like that's what you're trying to accomplish with your book. You're offering a way of looking at the world, one lens, right? Through your experiences and everything that you've learned through your life. You're kind of giving other people the opportunity to maybe look at the world through your life and what you've learned and maybe grow and change based on that if they want to. But it's not so much like a here is how you must do Buddhism kind of book, right?
Oh yeah, right. Well, if anything, it's a thing of take it seriously and learn it, but it's your own enlightenment. It's your enlightenment to either have or not have,
Yeah.
and it's your path to forge. And so I'm saying here, this is what has helped me. This is the path that I went. And if it helps you, that's great, but it could be on a very different path.
Would you call it a self-help book?
I would, but I wouldn't. I think it is, but I wouldn't bill it that way. I've come to a real distaste for clickbait books
Yep.
and self-help things that bill themselves as this is how you can. I mean, I don't remember if I actually left this in the book or not, but I wrote at some point that, I could have titled the book something like How to Become Enlightened in 4 Steps. And it wouldn't be inaccurate. I mean, it might be a number of steps and it might be, more flexible than an actual stairway. But I mean, it wouldn't be outrageous, but it would bill me as a clickbait author.
Yeah, you don't wanna be lumped in with
I
those
don't
people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, before we close, and I'm assuming we could go on forever, yeah, and as it is, I might have to learn new video editing skills but before we close, I wanna go back to you were talking about why we write, and the epigraph of my book is perhaps my favorite all-time poem, and I think I've discussed this with you. And I'm gonna read it and then say a couple things about it. It's called A Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. And I chose that because it talked to me since I was like 12 or 13. And my writing was a way of making connection. And when I decided to do that, I did some research on Walt Whitman's childhood, and he was on his own from the age of like 11 or 12 or something. And in some, I wasn't totally on my own, but my father died and my mother wasn't very, Carol sometimes says I brought myself up. And Whitman brought himself up. And I worked from the age of 13. He worked from the age of 11. And his writing was a way of connection. So that comes out in a later poem he wrote. And I don't remember if I mentioned this in the book or not, but he wrote another poem about a bridge. And he drew the connection of how other people would be walking on that bridge in generations and generations after him. And so obviously it was a motivator for him, and it was a motivator for me. where I don't know what Whitman's process was at all. But for me, I got to a point where I had to let go of the wanting to connect for ego to wanting to connect for the good I can do.
Yeah. Yeah. As an act of kindness for humanity. Right.
Sounds very highfalutin when you say it that way, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I know all the words, that's my job. So no, I mean, I understand what you're saying, that the idea that you're not connecting so that you can be recognized. It's not just I want to be seen, I want to be heard. It's I want to understand you and I want to be understood at the same time, which is exactly my philosophy about writing. So,
I have to be, I talk about total honesty. Well, here's a totally honest thing too. Everything I've said is true. The book is honest. I don't want the book to be clickbait. I don't want the title to be clickbait. I don't want to advertise it like clickbait. But in the uncertainty of today's economy and today's politics,
yeah.
and the fact that my wife and I are in retirement on pretty fixed income, I've gotten a little greedier about promoting it and a motive. Not this doesn't go into what the book is, but it
Mhm.
will go into how actively I promote it.
I think that's understandable. I mean, and I don't think you can fault yourself for that. Well, Mel, do you want to wrap it up?
Okay, well, I generally wish everybody you be well, may you be happy, may you live in equanimity, and everybody, thank you for, I hope, paying attention to us.